I'd like you to imagine that I have a tank of water in front of me, and I'm going to place my beach ball under the water and hold it there for a very long time. Because that's what it felt like I was doing. The pressure that came from the fear of anybody finding out about my secrets was like holding a beach ball constantly under the water. I was so scared about anybody finding out about what had happened that I'd buried this dark and shameful secret deep down inside of me. I thought that if people knew what had happened to me, they would look at me differently. They wouldn't want to know me anymore. They would change their opinion of me as if somehow this was a reflection of me. My self esteem was so low that I also assumed they would think about me the way that I thought about myself, that I was worthless, that I was broken, damaged goods. But that was the shame from my trauma speaking to me, and it lied to me for years, holding me back, robbing me of my voice, and silencing me. In fact, if anybody told me one day I would be delivering my first TEDx talk to an audience of just over 2,000 people, I would never have believed it. But I did. It was June 2019, and I spoke in Scotland. I was so nervous waiting to go on the stage in the wings. But once I got out onto that stage and I stood on that famous red dot, I thought to myself, well, this isn't about me speaking anymore, but who is listening and what my story can now do for other people. I have to say, though, it was one of the most terrifying, but also the most liberating moments of my life. I stood on that stage and I told the audience that at 13 years old, I had been gang raped and tortured in a very violent attack by two men. And I was okay. Nobody ran out of the audience screaming or fainted from shock or booed me off the stage. In fact, a head teacher got in contact with me to let me know he'd been there with a group of his students. And one young woman was so moved by what I was saying that not long after I had finished speaking, she turned to her teacher and told him that she had been raped too. The head teacher told me she had held her pain in for 3 years, but hearing me speak, it took just 3 minutes for her to find her voice. And sharing her story now has really changed her life. Sharing my story that day and speaking out on the stage was my way of facing my shame, I guess standing in it to shatter any shame that was left by doing the very thing I thought I could never do. We don't get rid of shame by avoiding it or constantly holding it down. I had to step into my shame, to face it, to release it. As Brené Brown says, shame loves silence, secret, and judgment. And my shame thrived in all of those areas. But it can't exist when we shine a light and expose all those dark shadows, chapters inside of us. And me speaking out took away any residue of shame that was left behind. Now, I don't expect you all to stand on a stage and share your story publicly like I now do. But if what I'm saying resonates with you in any way, find someone to share your story with so that you can let go of the shame that doesn't even belong to you and start your own healing journey. It's never too late. Sharing my story by speaking out about it and writing my memoir, Unbroken, has liberated me. But it was only when I was writing my book that I realized I had been raped 3 more times before the age of 18. I had no idea about consent back in those days. Basically, I said no, and they said yes, and carried on regardless. I was too scared to speak up, too scared to fight back in case it got violent. We need to teach our children about consent, respect, healthy relationships from a young age so they really understand what no means. What I know without a doubt is that 100% of all rapes are caused by rapists. It has nothing to do with the clothing I wore that day or the alcohol I drank. It came down to the fact that these two men chose to rape me and nothing else. When I was writing my book, somebody suggested to me that I could apply for my hospital notes. I had spent a few months in a children's psychiatric ward after a suicide attempt. And I really wanted to see, did they have any idea why this normal 13-year-old girl literally turned into one overnight who couldn't speak, eat, and hated herself. There was nothing in my notes to suggest they had any idea what had happened to me, that I'd experienced any trauma at all. Nobody ever asked me the right questions in there. Nobody ever asked me, what happened? We need to shift that conversation from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Stop labeling people and start asking the right questions. We have seen with the recent hashtag #MeToo phenomena that when one person speaks up, it encourages other people to find their voice too. And it took me decades to find my voice and break my silence. But I realized my voice is now my power, and I will not be quiet anymore. This is what I do now, and I'm going to continue to share my story to end the shame, the stigma, and the silence surrounding sexual violence, but also to help other people find their courage and their voice too, so that they can start their own healing journey, let go of any shame that they've been holding onto for years, and live their best, bravest, most courageous life. We know, or I know, that courage is contagious because it was hearing somebody else speak out that really helped me to find my voice. And I intend to pay that forward. And I'm so hopeful that the more of us that end our silence, speak up by finding our voice, we can really start to shift this culture. You know, I was on the internet one day and I came across this amazing organization called the Forgiveness Project. And their founder learned about my story and she asked if she could share it. She told me it could all be done anonymously. But I was so tired of being ashamed for a crime that was committed against my body. So I agreed. On the 22nd of September 2014, I will never forget that date, I shared my story with my name and my photo, ending 35 years of my silence. I have to say I was nervous pressing the button when I shared it on social media, but it has put me on the most incredible journey and opened up so many doors for me in ways I could never have dreamed. I've been on TV, radio, there's been newspaper and magazine articles, and I've written my book. And you know, it was just before my book was published that I truly learnt the power that comes when we share our stories, that we're not storytellers, but story healers. My publishers advised me not to do too much publicity and wait till just before the book was out, which made a lot of sense. But I was contacted by BBC Radio 4. They were making a program for their one-to-one series all about redemption, and they wanted to speak to me. And when I heard who was going to be my interviewer, you know, I just said yes, straight away, completely ignoring their advice. I was going to be interviewed by the British journalist and broadcasting legend, Sir Trevor MacDonald. If you don't know who he is, trust me, he is a legend, and I couldn't say no. So they flew me to London, and I went to the BBC studios, and we did our interview, which went really, really well. It was brilliant. But you know, what happened afterwards was more amazing. A friend of mine got in contact to let me know her mum had been listening to the radio that morning. And when she popped round to see her in the evening, she said she was really animated and keen to speak to her in a way she hadn't really seen before. And she turned to her and said, I was listening to this woman on the radio sharing her story, and I connected with everything that she said. It's just how it was in those days. You didn't speak about these things, you just got on with it. And my friend said, Mum, what was she talking about? Well, I always thought it was my fault that I'd walked myself into the situation like she did. I felt so ashamed and guilty, but she's made me realize that doesn't belong with me. It belongs with him. Mum, what are you saying? And my friend's mum turned to her and said, I was raped too, just like the woman on the radio was. And in that moment, my friend's 81-year-old mum ended 64 years of her silence. 64 years. Can you imagine holding that secret in for 64 years? My friend has said it's changed something in her mum, that she's lighter and more animated in a way she hasn't seen before. It's as if they've built a bridge which they've both crossed, and she shares other things too. She said she has seen the joy in her mum simply from listening to the radio and connecting with a woman sharing her story who understood. But she also thinks if she hadn't heard me that day, there's every chance she would have taken her story to the grave with her. And I agree. And that got me thinking of all the other men and women out there that have locked themselves into their own prison of silence due to their fear, their guilt, and their misplaced shame. Every time I'm asked to speak, I think of her because she has really single handedly shown me the power that comes when we share our stories. She is my motivation, and she is the reason I'm going to continue sharing my story until my dying breath. So, I want to go back to my beach ball and finish by asking you all a question. Do you feel like you are still constantly holding your beach ball under the water? Or could you face your shame to release it and let it go? Thank you.